If you handed a medieval peasant a glass of clean tap water and told him to drink it, he'd probably look at you like you just offered him a cup of poison, because to him, you basically did. Water in the Middle Ages wasn't hydration. Water was a death sentence dressed up as a liquid. And the people who figured that out, not through science, not through chemistry, not through anything resembling modern medicine, they figured it out by watching their neighbors drop dead, over and over and over again. So they did what any rational person would do. They switched to beer, all of them. Men, women, children, priests, kings, pregnant women, toddlers, everybody. If you lived in medieval Europe and you weren't drinking some form of alcohol at basically every meal, you were either very rich, very religious, or very close to dying of dysentery. And here's the thing that nobody tells you. They were actually right. Let's back up. The water problem in medieval Europe wasn't just it tastes bad, or it's a little murky. It was genuinely catastrophically dangerous. Rivers were used for everything: washing, dumping waste, tanning leather, slaughtering animals. The same river that someone bathed in upstream was the one a tannery was dumping chemicals into downstream, and also the one a family was drinking from at the bottom. There was no germ theory. Nobody knew what bacteria was. The word microorganism didn't exist. When people drank bad water and got sick, they blamed bad air, miasma, they called it, or sinful behavior, or the alignment of the planets, or just God being angry about something, which, let's be honest, he apparently was constantly in the Middle Ages. The actual mechanism, tiny invisible organisms living in water and destroying your intestines, was completely invisible to them. They just knew, empirically, from experience from watching their children die, that drinking from certain sources killed you. They just couldn't explain why. Beer, on the other hand, was brewed, and brewing involved boiling. And boiling, it turns out, kills pathogens, which they obviously didn't know, but the result was the same. Beer didn't kill you. Beer actually kept you alive. And when you're making life or death decisions without a microbiology degree, you work with what you've got. Now, medieval beer was not what you're imagining. It wasn't a cold IPA at a craft brewery. It wasn't even close. Medieval small beer, the everyday kind that everyone drank, including children, had an alcohol content of about 1 to 3%. For context, a modern light beer is around 4 to 5%. Small beer was closer to slightly fermented grain water. Enough alcohol to kill the bad stuff, not enough to get a 6-year-old blackout drunk before school. Well, usually the historian Richard Unger, who literally wrote a book called Beer in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, estimated that average daily consumption in some parts of medieval Europe was somewhere around 1 to 2 liters per person per day. Per person, including the kids, including the elderly, including people doing heavy manual labor, which is apparently when you need to be the least impaired. But here we are. And it wasn't just beer. Wine was huge in the Mediterranean parts of Europe, and it had the same advantage. The fermentation process made it safer than raw water. Monasteries produced wine and beer in enormous quantities, partly for sale, partly for themselves, and partly because monks apparently figured out early that slightly buzzed was a solid default state for getting through centuries of manual labor and Latin prayers. The monasteries actually deserve a full chapter here, because they were basically the medieval equivalent of a pharmaceutical company, crossed with a brewery, crossed with a hospital. Monks weren't just drinking beer because they liked it. They were systematically producing it, refining it, and this is the part that gets strange, using it as medicine. The Benedictine rule, written by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, originally said that wine was not suitable for monks. And then reality happened, and within a few generations, every major monastery in Europe had its own brewery or winery, because even the most devout abbot could look at the death rates and conclude that maybe God intended fermentation as a gift. Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century Benedictine abbess, composer, visionary medical writer, and genuinely one of the most interesting people of the entire medieval period, wrote extensively about the health properties of beer and wine. She recommended specific brews for specific ailments. She described the difference between good water and bad water, even though she didn't understand the mechanism. Her book Physica is full of this stuff. Practical, observational medical knowledge wrapped in theological language, because that was the only framework available. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't know why she was right. Now here's where it gets worse, because you might think, okay, at least they had something. At least the fermented drinks kept them alive. But the flip side of everyone drinks low-alcohol beer all day is that nobody was ever fully sober, and nobody was ever fully drunk. It was this permanent mild haze that just became the baseline of human existence for about 1,000 years. Think about what that means for productivity. Think about what that means for decision-making. Think about medieval surgeons. And yes, there were medieval surgeons. And yes, some of them were surprisingly competent, performing operations on patients who had been drinking since breakfast, while the surgeons themselves had also been drinking since breakfast, because there was genuinely no better option. Think about medieval architects. The people who built the Notre Dame Cathedral, which has stood for over 800 years and is a masterpiece of structural engineering. They designed and built that while operating on a brain that was perpetually soaked in low-grade ale. That's either inspiring or terrifying, and I'm not sure which. The historian Andrew Board, writing in the 16th century, put it bluntly. He said English ale was the natural drink of Englishmen, and that water was not wholesome for them. This wasn't a preference. This was medical advice. Doctors, actual physicians, were telling patients to drink beer instead of water. And they were correct. Based on the available evidence, they were absolutely correct. Here's the thing nobody ever talks about, though. Water wasn't always avoided. It wasn't a universal rule. Clean water, from mountain springs, from wells that weren't near animal waste, from rainwater caught in clean containers, was known to be fine. The problem was that clean water was hard to find, hard to store, and hard to transport. Beer was easy to make, easy to store, lasted longer, and had the bonus of being caloric, which mattered enormously when you were a peasant burning 3,000 calories a day, doing manual labor and eating bread. So the everyone drank beer instead of water thing was less of a choice and more of an adaptation. It was what happened when human beings encountered an environment where the safe option was also the fermented one, and they had no way to purify the unsafe option, and they had to survive regardless. The Romans had known about this problem too. Roman soldiers were famously given a ration of pasca, a mixture of water and vinegar, which worked on similar principles. The acidity of the vinegar made the water safer. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who died in 79 AD while observing the eruption of Vesuvius, which is a whole separate story about extremely bad decisions, wrote about the dangers of various water sources in his Naturalis Historia. The knowledge that some water was dangerous was ancient. The ability to do anything systematic about it took a very long time. The actual turning point, the moment when people started to understand why water was dangerous, not just that it was dangerous, came in the 19th century, and it came through one of the most important and most annoying stories in the history of medicine. Jon Snow, not the one from Game of Thrones, the actual physician, was working in London during the cholera outbreak of 1854. London at this point was a city of roughly 2.5 million people, most of whom were dumping their sewage into the Thames, which was also their water supply, which you would think would be an obvious problem. But the miasma theory was still dominant, and most people believed the smell was the disease, not the water. Snow was skeptical. He did something that sounds obvious now and was genuinely radical then. He mapped the cases. He went door to door in the Soho neighborhood, recorded who got sick and who didn't, and noticed that cases clustered around a specific water pump on Broad Street. He removed the handle from the pump, physically, just took it off, and the outbreak slowed dramatically. He was still mostly ignored. The medical establishment spent years resisting his findings because they contradicted the miasma theory that everyone had built their careers on. Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany would eventually prove germ theory in the 1860s and 1870s, and even then it took decades for the public health infrastructure to actually change. Municipal water treatment, the kind where they actually clean the water before sending it to your tap, didn't become widespread in Europe and North America until the early 20th century. Chlorination of water supplies started in the early 1900s. The thing that made your tap water safe to drink is roughly 100 years old, which means for essentially all of recorded human history, up until your great-grandparents' time, the medieval peasant's instinct, don't drink the water, was the correct instinct. And here's the part I want you to sit with for a second. We talk about the Middle Ages like it was this dark, irrational, superstitious time when people made decisions based on fear and ignorance. And yes, some of that is true, but the decision to drink beer instead of water wasn't superstition. It was empiricism. It was 1,000 years of collective observation that said, people who drink from the river die, and people who drink the brewed stuff don't. They didn't have the vocabulary for pathogens. They didn't have microscopes. They had outcomes, and they acted on them. In a weird way, they were doing science. Bad science, science without a theoretical framework, science without controlled variables, but science in the sense that matters most, which is, observe what happens, and do more of the thing that doesn't kill you. The thing we should be uncomfortable about isn't that they were wrong. They were mostly right. The thing we should be uncomfortable about is how long it took us to explain why they were right, and how confident the people who were completely wrong, the miasma theorists, the it's the bad air crowd, were for centuries, while the people who knew the answer couldn't get anyone to listen, because we still do that. We still have experts defending outdated frameworks against new evidence, sometimes for decades, because changing your mind requires admitting you were wrong, and humans, medieval or modern, are very, very bad at that. The only difference between us and the medieval peasant is that we got lucky enough to live in the century when someone finally pulled the handle off the pump.